Welcome to this episode of Weird Coffee Science. We find ourselves revisiting an old topic. It's a part 2, if you will. Now, some time ago, I did a test on coffee stored under high humidity. And it was a surprising, if divisive, test. And I did say that I might look at it again in the future because more time needed to pass to really understand what kind of preservation you get from storing coffee under high humidity. If you missed that episode, well, I would recommend going and watching it now. There's a link up here. But in summary, inside a bag of coffee was one of these. It holds coffee or anything you put with it, ideally cigars, I think, at 69% humidity. A very high level of humidity, but below that will encourage things like mold growth. So it's safe, it's just got a lot of moisture in the air. And I was intrigued because in the first test, the high humidity coffee tasted quite different and didn't necessarily taste worse. Some people preferred it, some people didn't like it as much. And that was after 1 month. Here we are after 4 months. One of the first things that I wanted to test was actually how much moisture had been absorbed by the coffee. There wasn't a very neat and easy way to do this, and so in this case what I did is I counted out 100 coffee beans from each bag, the high humidity and the regular humidity storage, and I weighed them. And the difference was quite surprising. The high humidity coffee weighed about 12% more than the regular coffee that had been stored in whatever atmosphere was inside the bag at the time of sealing. That seems like a big difference. It means that if you weigh 30 grams of coffee from the regular and the high humidity, you've got less coffee in the high humidity coffee because you're weighing out a higher portion of water within that. To have the same amount of actual coffee beans, to do a comparative test, you'd have to have 12% more coffee beans in a brew with the high humidity one than you would with the low humidity one. Now, I think what's also interesting is that it's only 12% heavier. That suggests that even though there is a lot more moisture available, that isn't necessarily penetrating, absorbing all the way to the center of each coffee bean. Even after roasting, those are dense little things. But it's time for a taste test. What we're going to do is very simple. We're going to brew 2 V60s. We're going to brew one with 30 grams of this coffee, the normal coffee, so to speak, that's been sat in a bag for 4 months, to 500 grams of water. And then using the same technique in terms of timings, all that kind of stuff, we're going to brew the high humidity coffee, but we're going to use 33.6 grams to start with, that kind of 12% bump to account for the additional water absorbed in those ground coffee beans. I'll brew those, and then I'll come back and see you. At this point, you're probably confused as to why there's 3 cups of coffee on the table when it was just a head-to-head, when it was the standard versus the high humidity. Why are there 3 coffees? Let me tell you. Let me first of all show you what happened when I brewed side by side these 2 coffees. Really different, really interesting, but really very different. It seemed as if the kind of high humidity coffee was much coarser. The water just rushed straight through it. The bloom was weird. The brew time was much faster, much faster. It was a totally different brew. Unsurprisingly, that much faster brew was a much weaker brew. And so I brewed one more time. I took that same higher dose, I ground it quite a bit finer, and I brewed again, trying to get a slower brew. And I got a bit of a slower brew, but not as slow. So we'll talk about the implications of that in a second, but I guess what I should be doing is tasting them. Now, it's me on my own, and so there's no way I can do this as a blind test in any functional way, and I suspect the differences are going to be so big that it would be kind of wasted anyway. So here we have the regular 4-month-old stored in a zip seal bag kept closed most of the time, coffee. Here we've got that first attempt that brewed a little bit too quickly, the high humidity coffee, and here we've got the second attempt that brewed a little slower, that is a matching strength and therefore theoretically a matching extraction. It's exactly what I thought it would taste like. It is stale coffee. It's not entirely unpleasant, it's just not very pleasant. There's some quite distinct kind of stale, slightly woody notes from the coffee there. Not great. Noticeably weaker, actually, way less texture to it. That's interesting. A little bit more acidity, but that could be a function of extraction. So maybe I just rule this one out. I don't know. Let's taste this one here. Okay, that's surprising. That's quite interesting. I'm just going to go back quickly for the high humidity coffee. Has more life to it, but it comes with downsides. There are some new flavors in here that are a little bit what people might politely call funky, or I might say a little bit fermenty almost. Now, I don't think any fermentation has happened, but that's sort of what reminds me of these kind of flavors in here. That kind of slightly natural or very, very high mucilage level honey process. I could see lots of people preferring this to that, and I could see a lot of people preferring this to that. If you don't mind a little funkiness in the cup, I think you might really like this. It's a really interesting development. It's slightly out of character for the coffee. It's slightly incongruous, but if you like those kind of flavors, I think you'll have a nice time. I don't often like those flavors, so it's not that I prefer the stale one, it's just this isn't bowling me over, so to speak. This is definitely worthwhile. If you tried it after the last video, I'd love to hear from you. Leave a comment down below if you join me in this particular journey. I don't think it was a wasted trip. This is definitely very interesting. And there are a couple more interesting implications that I want to talk about, but I need to do so after a couple of pieces of business. First of all, this video, like every video right now, has a giveaway. So if you are laid off, you're out of work, you don't have money, if you can't afford coffee, click the link in the description down below. I will pick 10 people every video, anywhere in the world that I can send coffee to, and I'll send you coffee. If you can afford coffee right now, please buy coffee from somebody local to you, someone you care about. Now, I'm able to do this because videos like this have a sponsor, and this video is sponsored by Squarespace. When I need to build a website, be it a website to showcase my book or a website that explains what I do for a living, I use Squarespace. You start by taking one of their beautiful templates and you customize it very easily, very intuitively, and before you know it, you've got something that's yours that is a great representation of who you are and what you do online. It could be a portfolio of your photography, a show reel, your writing, a small e-commerce business. It's all built right into Squarespace. There's nothing to patch, nothing to upgrade. It's easy and it's intuitive. But don't take my word for it. Use the link below, sign up for a free trial, and build something. At the end of 14 days when you're ready to launch, use code James Hoffmann for 10% off any website or domain. Thanks to Squarespace for sponsoring this video. The first thing I want to talk about is called Quenching. Now, this is something that in my coffee journey, I actually learned from Tim Wendelboe. I had gone to a seminar that he was giving in Dublin, and he talked about using quenching. Now, what quenching is at the end of roasting a batch of coffee, many craft roasters tend to just use a cooling tray to pull cold air or room temperature air through that very hot coffee to cool it down very quickly. With much larger roasting machines, that isn't really effective anymore. If you've roasted that coffee, certainly to kind of medium dark, there's too much thermal mass, there's too much thermal energy in there, and if you don't cool it incredibly quickly, it can keep roasting or at worst case kind of catch fire. With quenching, as coffee leaves the drum at the end of roasting, it's sprayed with a misting of water. So that water hits the very hot coffee, it instantly evaporates, and you get evaporative cooling that pulls a lot of energy, a lot of heat out of that coffee. Now, a good roaster will quench the barest of minimums. A bad roaster might quench excessively because they'll actually add some weight back into the coffee, and coffee loses between 12 and 20% of its mass during the roasting process, a lot of that being moisture that was in the green coffee that is evaporated out quite early on in the roasting process. Tim Wendelboe, at the lecture I talked about, well, he said he'd used quenching in situations where he needed the coffee to be used earlier on, right, where he wanted to sort of shortcut the resting period, then he would use quenching. And here, certainly we've seen something to give evidence to that. With that high humidity coffee, when it came to the bloom, there was no bloom. There was no outgassing at that point. The high humidity levels in the bag seemed to have pulled a lot of CO2 out of the coffee. And that was interesting. Which leads me into the second piece of this. The way that this thing ground. Now, I, with my eyes, am a very bad judge of grind size, grind distribution at any meaningful level. But when I ground the Humid sample, a little part of my brain said, that's a bit coarser. I'll show you a close-up, a high-res image of both coffees ground at the same grind setting. You can decide if you think there's any real difference between the two visually. Now that they're on the table, that's a huge difference between the two. These are ground at exactly the same grind setting. The color difference is really interesting. This is the same coffee, it's just been stored differently. What this does say is that the state of a coffee bean before you grind it has a massive impact on the way that it grinds. We've touched on this in Weird Science before when we've microwaved coffee to heat it up to have it produce a different grind profile. Here, it's a really, really dramatic change in the way that the coffee grinds. And it could be that as a higher humidity bean, it doesn't shatter quite the same way. It produces less fines because it's way less brittle. If anyone's watching this that has the really good toys for grind analysis and you want to run this experiment and share the results with us, I'd be very grateful. Let me know down in the comments below. And so that's it. That's this particular journey come to an end. I'm grateful to Humid for his idea and feedback along the way. The results are interesting. If you've tried it, let me know. If you're curious to try it now, let me know. As always, thank you so much for watching, and I hope you have a great day.